Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, David de Jong, and I'll introduce David in just a moment. Just some housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. You do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. And as ever, we'll try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility. This will allow you to send a message to the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, this event is being recorded. You'll find it on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. There you will also find recordings of other past events, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our speaker this evening. David de Jong was born in Amsterdam. He's a journalist and an author, and he's covered such topics as European banking and finance while based in his home city, and also hidden wealth, as well as the fortunes of billionaires for Bloomberg News while based in New York. His work has appeared in titles such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, among others. This book, Nazi Billionaires, is David's first book, which he wrote and researched while working in Berlin. David currently writes for the Dutch Financial Daily and other publications, and he joins us from Tel Aviv. David, a warm Milim welcome to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's good to be here.
Now, for the benefit of those who haven't read your book, can you explain in a nutshell what it's about?
Yeah, it's about Germany's wealthiest business dynasties today, and how their business patriarchs got involved with the Nazi regime, how they profited of the atrocities of the Third Reich, how they got away with their crimes, and how their heirs are dealing with it today.
How did you come to write this book?
I started working for Bloomberg News in New York in late 2011. And I was actually hired on a new investigative team that investigated family-owned companies, non-stock exchange listed companies. And I was actually hired as one of the reporters covering North America. But I was soon asked if I could cover the German or the Germanics, the German language countries, based on the fact that I'm Dutch. And so I started reporting on them from New York. I would spend a month a year in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and circulating kind of through the Bloomberg bureaus there, and yeah, reporting on kind of a mix of history and finance and business and history. And I came back with these stories that what I found was really this brazen whitewashing that was going on behalf of most notably BMW and the family that controls it, as well as Porsche and Volkswagen, and well, Porsche mainly, and the families that control Porsche, and the way they were celebrating the business successes of their patriarchs, their fathers, their grandfathers, but leaving out their war crimes. And that is really what led me to write Nazi Billionaires.
So who specifically are these families, and I suppose why these in particular?
So the criteria, as you may call them, to qualify for my book, or to have qualified for Nazi Billionaires, is, you still have to be a business dynasty in Germany that is relevant today. So you still have to, be very relevant in global business as well as European business, as well certainly German business today, but particularly on a global level, because they control brands that, all of us recognize. And then secondly, the families or the patriarchs of the dynasties I write about had to have, engaged in mass weapons production, had to have profited from the expropriation of Jewish-owned businesses, as well as businesses owned by families in occupied territories, as well as, you know, mass exploited forced and slave labor in their factories and mines. So that's how, you know, the 5 families I write about, or 6 actually, I write about, qualified for the book. And they are the Quant family, which is the main family of the book. 2 of their one branch descends from the poorer branch, descends from Magda Goebbels, which is a story unto itself. And the richer branch, 2 of their heirs today are the controlling shareholders of BMW today. The BMW group includes not only BMW, but also Mini and Rolls-Royce. And 2 of their heirs, Stefan Quandt and Susanne Klatte, are today Germany's wealthiest family with an estimated fortune of 50 billion. So that's one dynasty, these 2 branches. And then you have the Flick dynasty. Patriarch was Friedrich Flick. And they are mainly known for having been the controlling shareholders of Daimler-Benz. Today they manage their fortunes. They no longer have an operative company, but they, you know, manage their billions through family offices, investing in real estate, private equity, hedge funds, art, etc., etc. Thirdly is the von Fink family, which is a financiers family that co-founded Allianz and Munich Re, the largest insurers and reinsurers in the world today. They also owned a private bank called Merck Fink, which was sold to Barclays a few decades ago. Fourthly, there's the Porsche Pierre clan, which today controls the largest car maker in the world, the Volkswagen Group, which not only controls Volkswagen or produces Volkswagen and Porsche, but also Audi, Lamborghini, Bentley, Seat, Skoda. And then fifthly, there's the Oetker family, which we all know as the family that produces the baking powder, baking mixes, cake mixes, but most notably, of course, the Dr. Oetker frozen pizzas. But they also own a chain of luxury hotels, including the Lanesborough in London, Germany's largest beer brewer. It's really a diversified conglomerate with shipping and many other aspects. So those are the 5 I write about.
Why is it you think this this story hasn't been told previously?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think in a way, the way these families have purportedly reckoned with their Nazi histories or their Third Reich histories is within the confines of Germany and within the confines of the German language. So to really understand this question is to take a step back and look at kind of the mechanisms that are used whenever a scandal breaks, or with regards to whenever a German journalist, for example, because there are many German journalists that dig up, you know, the dark Nazi history of beloved business patriarch X or beloved German brand Z. The response of the family or the business families and the companies involved are always immediately, we're going to commission a renowned historian to independently investigate our family history, our company history, and it's going to be published in a study. And that is what happens. You don't hear from the historian and a team of research for 4 years as they plow through, you know, countless of archives in Europe and also often in the UK and the United States. But then 4 years later, a 1,200-page study in dense academic German is published. And the findings itself are, broadly outlined, but the details, of course, remain kind of hidden in plain sight because, the German public doesn't really have, they're not going to read a 1,200-page study on the atrocities that, company X or patriarch Z perpetrated. And let alone, it's inaccessible to anybody who doesn't read academic German or German as a whole. Which also begs the question, who is the reckoning with? Because of course, the vast majority of victims of the Third Reich were not German. They came from all over Europe. And the details of the crimes or the bigger picture remains inaccessible to, say, former forced and slave laborers or their heirs, who certainly did not come from Nazi Germany. Oh, well, for 99% did not come from Nazi Germany and didn't speak or read German. So in a way, the facts are hidden in plain sight because none of these studies ever get, bar a few exceptions, ever get published translated into other languages. If they do, they get translated into English, but very few. So that's really, when I got the idea for the book back in 2014 already, I realized there was no such investigation written in the English language or in any language outside of German, as it were. And to the why, I don't know. I mean, I've always wondered that myself, Jonathan. I always wondered why nobody else. I was always worried somebody was going to scoop me to the subject because, I mean, so many people could have, in a way, well, I guess not so many because you need to be fluent in German and you also need to be able to write in English. But yeah, I thought maybe a German journalist would write it. I do think that a benchmark I do think it's very difficult for German journalists to write about the subject in a way, because, I know the libel laws in the UK are very, very strict, but German press laws are also very strict. And there is this culture in Germany where power is still less unassailable. It is still more respected. Germany is still a very conservative society at its heart. It's in many ways very provincial and old-fashioned. And I was always worried that these families, were going to send legal letters or were going to threaten things, which they never did, mind you. No, I never got any kind of threat whatsoever. But I'm Dutch, and I write in English, but if you're a German journalist who write about a subject as fraught as this one, I think just the sheer idea that you're writing kind of this expose on 5 of Germany's, most powerful business studies, who are not only economically extremely powerful, but also politically powerful, in the sense that they're the biggest donors to Germany's leading parties, mainly the CDU, the Christian Conservative, Angela Merkel's party. That it's difficult for German journalists still to write about it, and also because these families also lean on this enormous, and it's another reason why I think this subject has never really gone, has never really been known outside Germany, because they very much heavily lean on this notion of collective guilt in Germany, where at one hand, the German public is inundated with revelations still today with regards to, not only businesses, but to every aspect of society, with revelations with regards to a dark history of aspects of German society in the context of the Third Reich. And, they're slightly desensitized too, I would say. So, yeah.
So it really, the scrutiny that's come from within Germany has been met in a very predictable manner, because it's nothing really new, and everybody was doing it. It's really scrutiny from outside of Germany that might make a difference.
Yeah, that's the way I viewed it, and that's the way, in a way, it hasn't been, because the German translation was published. The English language version of my book came out April 19. The English translation came out May 5th. And I do notice that, also the way it's done extremely well in sales in Germany, of the German version, these histories aren't really well, even though these families are very well known. Of course, these brands, these are Germany's pride and joy, brands like BMW, Porsche, Oetker, Daimler-Benz, Volkswagen, Audi, etc. But most of the families also, most of the German public also doesn't know the histories of these families. I mean, they've effectively been able, in a way, to hit the stories in plain sight, to kind of pacify them through the context of academia as well. Where they can point to the study and say, well, listen, it's all in there, and then everybody's so. Oh.
And do you think these studies are really impartial?
I do. I do. I mean, they were important secondary sources to me as well. And with bar the exception of one study, the Porsche study, which was a study that was commissioned by the Porsche company and by extension the Porsche PF clan in 2015, and that was a partial whitewash of and looked at the beginning stages of the Porsche company, or the Porsche car design company, in the early 1930s all the way to the early 1950s. It was a partial whitewash, and was basically a history professor, a prominent one at that, who was a hired gun and basically did a cover up through academia. But with that exception, most of these studies that are commissioned by these families or companies are exceptionally good, and the academics that do them, both German or British or American, do an impeccable job.
Is there anything in your own family past that connects you to this period, or the behavior of the Nazis?
Well, certainly. I mean, my grandparents, like tens of millions of other Europeans, were, the victim of both occupation as Dutch people living in the Netherlands, as well as persecution, both from my Jewish grandparents, from my father's side, my paternal grandparents, as well as my Protestant grandparents from my mother's side, my maternal grandparents. My maternal grandfather, was a very avid sailor and tried to flee to tried to sail with his best friend to England to join the Royal Air Force. And on the second attempt, their boat, this is in 1941, their boat was blown back to shore, and they were arrested by German soldiers. And my grandfather and his best friend were convicted as political prisoners, and were forced to work in the Ruhr area in Bochum, in a steel factory. And my grandfather, who was a very tall man, like many Dutch people, came out weighing, being emaciated and being close to death, and weighing, being very close to death, and being, luckily he survived after his release. And my Jewish grandparents, they my Jewish grandfather hid in Amsterdam for 3.5 years, but his wife, my grandmother, together with my 3-year-old aunt Jacqueline, who's 83 today, and a companion of them, fled to, my grandmother was Swiss, and fled to the French-Swiss border. This was 1942, mind you, so it was really in, when the deportations on continental Europe to extermination camps were really, really starting to to take off, they were arrested at the French-Swiss border or detained by Gestapo officer, who miraculously took pity on my grandmother and her 3-year-old daughter, and said something like, hide tonight and report back tomorrow, or stay the night, go to a hotel tonight and report back tomorrow. And they fled that night over the mountains and into the safety of Switzerland. But their companion, a well-known painter called Max van Dam, reported back actually the next day, because he left his suitcase there, and was deported from Drancy, the infamous deportation camp in France, to Sobibor, where he was murdered. So yeah, so again, like tens of millions of other Europeans, my grandparents too were subject, to persecution and occupation. But that informed me about history, and it made me feel very lucky to be alive today. But that is not the reason why I wrote a book, because that is always what people ask. But it's really this, my family history just informed, made me aware of history. And again, made me be happy to be alive. But it's really this kind of, as a financial journalist, the kind of brazen whitewashing, where you have global foundations, media prizes, academic chairs, corporate headquarters, in the name of successful businessmen, which were successful businessmen, but were also Nazi war criminals, and that all being left out on the website of media prizes and charitable foundations and academic chairs, is really wanting to show that to a global audience. Was really, for me, my driver and my impetus to do my reporting.
So let's talk a bit about what specifically these businessmen did during the war. And your story progresses in strands for each family, but I think most fascinating is Quant. Because his wife leaves him and ends up with Goebbels, which actually bizarrely seems to be the making of Quant, that his wife going off with a Nazi actually makes him even more successful than he probably would have been otherwise.
Ooh, I don't know about that. I think he used it very cleverly after the war to exonerate him, to try to exonerate himself. But so Günther Quandt is the main patriarch of the Quandt dynasty. He was born in 1881, and he was born into this wealthy textile producing family in the provinces outside of Berlin, near Berlin to north of Berlin. And he actually, the family business is really successful during World War I, because they produce uniforms for the German Empire, and of course so many, well, on both sides obviously, but on the German side, of course, there were so many casualties, both wounded and dead, that they made, well, literally a killing producing uniforms for the German Empire, for the German Empire military, the Imperial Army. That was the name exactly. And afterwards, with that money, he goes to Berlin. He moves to Berlin to establish himself as a businessman. But then in October 1918, his first wife, Antonia, dies during the Spanish flu pandemic. And he's suddenly left at age 37, a widower, having just moved to the bustling capital, but on the verge of of an empire being defeated and ending. And he 3 months later, he meets a 17-year-old girl on the night train from Berlin to central Germany. And that girl, her name at the time is Magda Friedlander. She's born as Magda Ritschel. And he becomes enamored with her, and after 3 dates asks her for her hand, and they get married. And it's a disaster of a marriage. But they have one son, Harold. And within a decade, the marriage is annulled. And she goes, and then she falls in love with Joseph Goebbels, and of course becomes Magda Goebbels, and arguably the most infamous spouse of the Third Reich, and arguably also the most powerful. But in the meantime, Günter Quandt has parlayed his family capital into becoming one of Germany's wealthiest industrialists, because during the hyperinflation era of the Weimar Republic, he stages 2 hostile takeovers of 2 major global companies, one called AFA, which is a battery company, which today is known as Varta, was a very well-known battery company, but also which produces the batteries in airpods and such. And secondly, of DWM, which was a massive armaments manufacturer. So he's very well positioned once the Third Reich starts to profit from German rearmament first, as Hitler initiates his mass rearmament program, first in secret and then goes public with it in 1935. And of course, from 1935 onwards, Günter Quandt and many of the other businessmen in my book start profiting from the expropriation of Jewish-owned business families or Jewish-owned businesses, and the expropriation of Jewish families, and that, of course, during the war, extends to the expropriation of businesses in German occupied territories. And from 1941 onwards, the third aspect of profiteering, of Nazi profiteering, is the mass exploitation of forced and slave labor. And Günter Quandt ends up exploiting almost 60,000 forced and slave laborers, including thousands of concentration camp captives, in his battery and arms factories, aided by his son Herbert.
And of course, Ferdinand Porsche is doing a similar thing, but he has a Jewish business partner prior to the war.
Yes. So in December 1930, Ferdinand Porsche and his son-in-law Anton Pierre, together with their business partner Adolf Rosenberger, who was a former race car driver and turned businessman, he was a financial backer of the Porsche car design firm. And Ferdinand Porsche, Adolf Rosenberger, who was Jewish, was also the commercial director of the Porsche car design firm. And Ferdinand Porsche is this mercurial car designer, and is, spends prolifically on his car designs. So the company is founded in December 1930, but on January 30th, 1933, which coincidentally is also the day that Adolf Hitler seizes power in Germany, Adolf Rosenberger resigns as commercial director of the Porsche car design firm, because he doesn't want to be, because the Porsche car design firm is on the brink of bankruptcy. And Adolf Rosenberger is fed up with, raising money from, putting his own money in, but raising money from friends and family to keep the Porsche car design firm afloat. And he resigns, but he stays on as a shareholder. Now, this all changes in July 1935, when Adolf Rosenberger is bought out of his shares of the Porsche car design firm for the nominal value that the nominal value of his shares of December 1930. But at that point in time, by July 1935, the Porsche car design firm has become a very profitable endeavor, because in the meantime, of course, Ferdinand Porsche has convinced Hitler to let him design the prototype of the Volkswagen, the car of the people, which and he has become Hitler's favorite engineer. And countless of assignments have been thrown the way of the Porsche company. So Ferdinand Porsche and his son-in-law Anton Pierre buy out of Rosenberger far under the market value of his shares. And such a transaction becomes known as an Aryanization, which is a horrible euphemism, but it denotes to remove the Jewish element of ownership from an asset, whether that is shares, in the case of Rosenberger, any real estate, art, jewelry. Initially had the veneer of a legal business transaction, but as the 30s progressed and as persecution was ramped up, it extended to outright robbery of Jewish families and Jewish business owners.
Presumably it wasn't just these families, it was fairly widespread that this was happening. We have a question from Selma Tablet, who asks, were any of the factories actually humane to their slave labor workforces?
No, there were not. There are, to give you the big picture, there were about 12 to 20 million people, men, women, children, deported from all over mainland Europe to German factories and mines. At the lowest bottom of the rung were Jewish concentration camp captives who were loaned out by the SS, which ran concentration camps, in a way. Of course, the Jewish concentration camp captives that were loaned out to companies were lucky in the sense that they weren't directly sent to extermination camps in German occupied Poland. But often when they were kept on these so-called sub-concentration camps, which were concentration camps that were erected on factory complexes owned by men such as Günter Quandt or Friedrich Flick or Ferdinand Porsche, they were subjected to horrible abuse by SS guards, both in the sub-concentration camps as well as on the factory premises. There was no medical, there was no medical care. There was insufficient food. The working environment in the factories and in the mines were terrible. They didn't get protective clothing. Limbs would get stuck in machinery. People were beat up for random reasons. People were, when they tried to flee, they were executed, either shot on the spot or hanged. There were capos, which were kind of criminal camp, also concentration camp inmates who were assigned by camp leadership to beat and torture fellow camp inmates. And that was the order of the day in such sub-concentration camps on factory premises. Now, one rung higher, but not much, were the millions of Eastern Europeans or from Slavic countries that were deported, and which was the vast majority of people that were forced into slave labor. Were the millions of those from Eastern Europe, German occupied Eastern Europe, that were deported to German factories and mines. millions from Russia, from Ukraine, from Belarus, from Poland. And of course, since they were members of the by Hitler despised Slavic, minority, they were also treated horrifically. Those that were treated best, comparatively, were those that came from Western and Northern Europe. Dutch forced laborers that were rounded up in razzias, and that weren't Jewish, were generally, because Germans were like, well, they are from, in their sick kind of racial hierarchy, they saw them as their own, or Danes, or Swedes, Norwegians, etc. So that was to give you a very brief, and mind you, of those 12 to 20 million people that were deported to work in German factories and mines, 2.5 million died, and this is outside of, the 6 million that were murdered in the Holocaust. So yeah, this is a very brief and incomplete overview of that, but no, they were not treated well.
So Germany loses the war.
Yeah.
What happens then? Because these businesses, presumably it's well known that they were stolen. What happens to them?
In occupied Germany, everything under the Soviet occupation is expropriated by the Soviet authorities. So everything in East Berlin, Brandenburg, Saxony is expropriated. So many of, Günter Quandt, who was operated from Berlin, and Friedrich Flick, who also operated from Berlin, many of their factories and mines are in the eastern part of Germany are expropriated by the Soviet authorities. So they would lose about half of their assets for those that operated there, mind you, because for those in Western Germany, the Allied forces, both American and British, and to a lesser extent French, eventually there was an asset freeze there was asset control initially in the first few years of Germany being occupied, but by 1950, all of the men in question that are those that I write about, because I had gotten all of their assets back. Sometimes even those they had Aryanized or expropriated, because restitution claims were denied on jurisdictional grounds, or there were simply no surviving heirs anymore, survivors or surviving heirs anymore to could claim their assets back. So, and this is also what, one of the things that my book shows is kind of this continuity of money and power from Nazi Germany, and then you have this vacuum of 5 years between 1945 and 1950, where Germany is occupied or is under the occupation authorities of mainly the United States and as well as the UK, but the US was really kind of in charge. And into West Germany, where from the 1950s, an economic boom kind of, continues or causes the economic continuity of the families, which were already, mind you, with the exception of the Porsche PF family or clan, the families I write about in my book were already exceptionally wealthy before Hitler seized power. They were wealthy during the German Empire, they were wealthy during the German Republic, during the Weimar Republic. They amassed even greater wealth during the Third Reich. And that wealth continued unabated in Western Germany with the assets that they still had, which were very sizable. You know, it was this. We're talking about big companies here and financial interests and etc.
Is there any evidence of any shame or regret or of these people trying to distance themselves from what they did?
Not by the business patriarchs I write about. There's zero kind of reflection. There's zero apologies or some such. No, there's none of that. No. You know, from the heirs only when they're forced to, only when it becomes in the public eye, and they're forced to issue a mea culpa, but then it's still quite half-heartedly. And of course, it's only paying lip service. It's not really taking responsibility for history, or not really taking kind of a moral responsibility, because, you know, the proof is in the pudding. You know, they continue maintaining these global foundations and media prizes and academic chairs and corporate headquarters in the names of their fathers and grandfathers, without being transparent about what crimes they committed after these crimes have become known, or after they had commissioned to have these crimes investigated. They still try to hide them in plain sight, or hide them at all.
Now, later on, you introduce another family, the Rymans, who are also a very wealthy and powerful family. But there is something quite bizarre about the heirs, the heirs to this fortune.
Yeah. So the Rymans have a very tragic story. So in March 2019, Germany's largest tabloid, well, it's actually a story that broke in the Daily Mail, strangely enough, in September 2018. The Ryman family, which controls this conglomerate called JAP, acquires Pret-a-Manger for £1 billion. And what turns out is that two Daily Mail reporters dive into the archives and find the patriarch of the Ryman family, called Albert Ryman, finds his Nazi membership card. And they go to and apparently I didn't know that either, but the founder of Pret-a-Manger was a Jewish Londoner, and who has died a couple of years before, but his sister is interviewed and is confronted with the fact that the family that has bought Pret-a-Manger stems from a Nazi patriarch, and she says, you know, I'm horrified. We're a Jewish family. We had no idea. But that's kind of it, you know. Their press people for the Ryman said, yes, Albert Ryman was a Nazi party member, but, you know, we paid compensation, and we used forced laborers in our chemical company, but we paid compensation, and, you know, that's about it. And about 6 months later, this massive front page news scandal or news story is on the front page of the Bild on Sunday, which is Germany's largest tabloid, saying the hidden history of the Ryman, of Germany's second wealthiest family, the Ryman family. And it's about how Albert Ryman and his father were, you know, ideological Nazis who served for the Nazi party in their municipality in southern Germany, who wrote letters to Himmler saying, you know, we're an Aryan family, we're an Aryan company, and whose sister even joined. I mean, it was really a family of committed Nazis. Sister married an SS man, you know, and in their company, Bankiser, which later becomes known as Racket Bankiser, you know, hundreds of forced laborers are exploited and abused. You know, the Ryman, fathers and Ryman get off scot-free, like all the other men, with the exception of Friedrich Flick in my book as well, and kind of forget about it. And then, so the Ryman family reacts, or kind of their consigliere reacts, saying, you know, we went wide as the wall when we heard about these revelations, etc., etc. We had already commissioned a historian to investigate our past independently, and etc. Yeah, and such. Now the story gets even more bizarre and more tragic, because 3 months later, two of the Ryman heirs sit down with the New York Times bureau chief in Berlin, Katrin Benhold, and tell their story, how their father, Albert Reimann, was a committed Nazi, but their mother, Emily Landecker, was actually of Jewish descent, and her father, was murdered in the Holocaust. And Albert Reimann and Emily Landecker have this affair. Albert Reimann is married, but has a childless marriage, has an affair with his employee, Emily Landecker, or it was not even an affair, I mean, it was really a relationship which his wife knew about. And he fathers 3 children with them, who are today Germany's second wealthiest family behind the Quants. And whereas, you know, today, the Quant family, or the Quant heirs that control BMW, maintain a foundation in the name of their father, Herbert Quant, who, you know, the BMW Foundation, Herbert Quant, has the motto, inspire responsible leadership, in the name of a man who designed, built, and dismantled a sub-concentration camp in German-occupied Poland, bought stolen companies from Jews in France, had the responsibility over thousands of forced slave laborers in battery factories in Berlin, including hundreds of female concentration camp captives from Auschwitz and Sachsenhausen, and used at his own private estate forced laborers and prisoners of war. But they maintained that foundation. The Rymans did the opposite. They decided to rename their foundation, named after their Nazi father, and rename it after their murdered grandfather, Alfred Landecker, and fund it in perpetuity with 200 million pounds every 10 years. But by still being transparent about the fact that they named it after Alfred Landecker, but they're still transparent about the fact that Albert Reimann Jr. and Sr. were committed Nazis, and that their family company exploited hundreds of forced laborers. And that, you know, is kind of the jarring comparison, where you have the BMW Quants, which not only maintain completely whitewash Herbert Quant's Nazi history, or don't mention anything of it. I mean, the fact that they have this motto, I mean, it's a massive, go to the BMW Foundation Herbert Quant website. It's a massive global foundation, has 150 million in assets. And the reason that he inspired responsible leadership is because he saved BMW from 1959 and made his family the wealthiest in Germany, and one of the wealthiest in the world. Similarly, you have the Herbert Quant Media Prize, where you have 4 of Germany's most prominent journalists sit on the jury. And they have a whitewash biography of him on the website of a journalist, which is impressed. I mean, it's you know, it's beyond perverse. And similarly, the Porsche family does a similar thing with the Ferry Porsche Foundation, where they fund an academic chair, Germany's first academic chair in corporate history. And then they say, you know, if you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you're going. The Porsche family has never spoken about Ferdinand Porsche's legacy as, you know, well, as not the designer of the Volkswagen, but as the one who led the Volkswagen factory, where tens of thousands of forced slave laborers were exploited, including thousands of concentration camp captives, to produce weapons during the war, not cars, because the Volkswagen was never produced, was only 630 were produced during the war. But they have also not spoken out about their father, Ferry Porsche, who was the designer of the first Porsche sports car. was a voluntary SS officer who surrounded himself with former high-ranking SS officers as Porsche CEO in the 1950s and 60s, and spewed virulent anti-Semitic vitriol about Adolf Rosenberger in the late 1970s in his first autobiography, We at Porsche. Mind you, Adolf Rosenberger at that point in time had died. He had died 9 years prior in Los Angeles at the age of 67, so he couldn't defend himself. But you know, it is that kind of, I mean, blatant disregard. It's not even disregard. I mean, it's a whitewash. It's built up men who you know, who are either committed war crimes or were members of you know, organizations such as SS, which was mostly responsible for perpetrating the Holocaust, and whitewashing them blatantly. I mean, there is no other word for it.
We have a question from Tim Friedman, who is asking about the later family members, whether any of the later generations expressed regret or made reparations of any sort for the activities of their forebears.
I mean, I didn't really, they expressed regret, which I always say it stops short of apologizing. Some have expressed regret, but they haven't really properly apologized for the, you know, on behalf of, given the sheer amount of you know, victims that their fathers and grandfathers in whose offices they're named after, they work in today, or the companies named after them they run today, perpetrated. In terms of compensation, you know, in 1999 there was this mass compensation settlement between the German government and the United States. After the Iron Curtain fell, you know, Germany's biggest companies were threatened with class act lawsuits in the United States from surviving forced and slave laborers, as well as from former Soviet republics, those former forced slave laborers that were freed from behind the Iron Curtain. And they, you know, came to this mass settlement and started paying out compensation between 2001 and 2006, you know, where half of the money was about £5 billion. Half of that money was ponied up by the German state, and the other half was paid up by German business. Mind you, 60% of that money only came from 17 companies, even though there were 6,500 German companies that subscribed to that foundation that paid out the compensation claims. But it's very important to note that in that settlement, explicitly, German companies did not have to admit any kind of culpability or wrongdoing. So it was purely the payment of money. It was not really properly taking responsibility for their act. It was not kind of taking any moral responsibility. It wasn't apologizing. It was just paying out of money because they were worried that it was gonna hurt their sales, standing, and share price.
We have another question from Richard Stevenson. He says, we pull down statues of old slave owners in the UK. Obviously, this happened long before. Why is there no collective backlash against German companies? Is the world turning a blind eye? Why isn't there discussed an outcry in the same way as with the discussions about the slave trade?
I think because these companies and these families have done a really good job, or particularly these companies, of kind of pacifying it. I think in a way, they, you know, it's a word that it's a contemporary word that's overused, but in a way it's being gaslighted. They're gaslighting us in a way, in a sense that so much of the world has come to believe, and they have, you know, Germany has done, in many aspects of their society, has done an incredible job with reckoning with the past. I mean, really, they have done in many aspects of society. But it is, you know, the most powerful and the wealthiest of German society who are sidestepping this reckoning, or are paying at best lip service to this reckoning. And you know, in a way, kind of, yeah, they're hiding their histories in a way, and because so much of the world thinks that because German society as a whole has done such a great job at reckoning with its past, automatically it's a business world which is included in that, because there has been this mass compensation settlement, there have been a lot of individual restitution settlements over time, and you know, there is this general consensus in the world that oh, Germany has done such a great job, so you know, German companies take, you know, they hide in a way behind that the global perception.
So let's finish with a question from Alan Mann. He says, were you surprised that none of these families made threats directly or indirectly to you? Do you think too many years have now passed? They may have become anesthetized to such revelations.
Yeah, maybe it's part, I think they just want to ignore it because it's convenient for them. Because I mean, going back in a way to what Alan was saying, or the question Alan posed, you know, in a way, if they ignore it, you know, if they don't pay attention to it, if they're going to try to threaten me or something, you know, you don't want, as a family who controls BMW and Porsche is being spun off out of the Volkswagen group and is getting ready to be listed on a stock exchange for an estimated value of 100 billion. The last thing you want is to have your shareholders or the family, that the controlling family, start suing reporters or at least send legal threats to reporters. The smartest thing to do, I guess, is to ignore it, and that's what they've done so far, but not, you know, not very well, because the BMW Foundation, Herbert Quandt, there's all these people who are getting money from it, including a British Israeli guy called who sent me an email who said, I'm furious that I've been lied to by the BMW Foundation, Herbert Quandt, about who Herbert Quandt was, and who invited me to come speak to the other fellows at the BMW Foundation, Herbert Quandt. And now they're now in this quandary between people who have received their money, who are furious of the whitewashing they engaged in, and their conservative controlling shareholder, the son of Herbert Quandt, Stefan Quandt, Germany's richest heir, wealthiest heir, who of course doesn't, you know, who doesn't want to change anything and who wants to keep his father's name on his media prize and on the BMW Foundation.
It would certainly make me think twice before buying another BMW, and I'm sure others will feel the same. David, thank you so much for being our guest this evening. We could talk, I'm sure, for another hour, but people will have to buy the book. And the book is a real page turner. There's lots of revelations in here. There's lots of astonishing facts uncovered. There is a link on our website. There's a link on the email you'll get tomorrow, or any other good bookseller will have this available to you. And to say thank you, David, I'm going to send you this. This is a book of my photographs of Magen David Adom. You'll be familiar with their ambulances.
Yes, indeed.
As a resident of Tel Aviv.
Absolutely,
so I spent time with them and photographed them. So that will wing its way to you, very, very soon. You're very welcome. Now, just a few words about our upcoming program before we leave you. Next week, we have Professor Nir Arieli. He's Associate Professor of International History at the University of Leeds, and he's telling us all about the Dead Sea. And then on the 11th of July, Simon Parkin is our guest. He's speaking about the British wartime internment of Jewish refugees suspected, I beg your pardon, of being Nazi spies. And then the following week, the Mancunian Bernard Lester will be giving us a humorous look at his 50 years of being a dentist. We have amazing speakers coming up. We are booked now pretty much for the rest of the year. So please visit our website at milliam.org.uk to book your tickets and sign up to our newsletter to make sure you don't miss out on anything. All of our events are free, but you can make a small donation if you wish. There is a link in the chat, or find a donation button on our website. It remains for me to thank our guest, David de Jong, once again. Thank you, David, for being with us.
Thanks, Jonathan, for having me.
And looking forward to seeing you all at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon. Bye.
Likewise. Bye.